David Carey Jr. is Professor of History and Women and Gender Studies at the University of Southern Maine. He holds a PhD in Latin American Studies from Tulane University. His publications include Our Elders Teach Us, Maya Cachiquel, Historical Perspectives, published by the University of Alabama Press in 2001. Another, A History of Cachiquel People, and also Engendering Mayan History, Mayan Women as Agents and Conduits of the Past, 1875-1970, published by Routledge 2006, and it's available for sale. It was available for sale at the reception and may be available after this talk. He's the author of over a dozen of peer-reviewed articles and essays, and the co-editor of Latino Voices in New England, published in 2009, and editor of Distilling the Influence of Alcohol, Aguardiente in Guatemalan History, published by the University Press of Florida in 2012. He is currently working on a manuscript about crime, cross-dressing, bootlegging, and other transgressions in 20th century Guatemala. So there is no better person to tell us about what's going to happen to us next month. Thank you. Please help. David.
Nave ni maho ni matioshik chiwe rish, ni maho ni matioshik chire mia Anouar, iri limati hobol di Universidad de New England, vicino di Center for Global Studies. Hanila yikikot inko iwikin wakamin, yotikir yotzihon huba, yotikir ni katamach huba paruidi yocherkan rutzihor ichini maya. So I won't give the whole thing in Maya, but just little pieces of it. So the rough translation is just I wanted to thank Anouar, the Center for Global Studies, and you all for coming out this evening to listen to this talk. And I also, it sort of puts me at ease to start in a little bit of a Mayan language when I'm speaking before a big group, which I think you'd agree is a little bit more innocuous than imagining you all in your underwear. So you can probably appreciate my using that as a strategy to put me at ease. And I have to admit, I sort of was thinking about this talk and very much humbled by being invited here. I know Anouar has been able to get some really amazing sort of international speakers, Bill McKibben, Noam Chomsky, William Cronin. And then it occurred to me that perhaps Anouar thinks the world is going to end next month, and he thought he'd roll the dice with this last one, right? There's only a few weeks left. So yeah, that's what I want to talk about tonight, and that is sort of examining this 2012 phenomena, this end of the world story that's been pegged to the Maya. And ultimately, I also want to take the opportunity to look at both the ancient Maya and the modern Maya in a broader perspective within this context. And in many ways, my argument will be that this phenomena, this 2012 doomsday phenomena, is far more related to a sort of US, European, Western fascination with doomsday prophecy and ideas of the apocalypse than it is to any sort of Maya predictions or calendrics or archaeological evidence. And this is not to say that Maya don't see this as an important moment, December 21st, 2012. But they see it more as a sort of new dawn, as an opportunity in which more hopeful relations and a more positive future might emerge. Right? And I also want to make a point about what I see as a sort of remarkable resiliency on the part of Maya peoples. Thinking about even going back to that history right at the time of the Spanish invasion, Maya dealing with the issue of the conquest and then 300 years of colonialism. And then in the modern independent period, Maya dealing with discrimination, racism, as it starts to get even more intense civil war and then sort of amplifies into genocide. And throughout all of those sorts of struggles and privations, Maya have been able to maintain aspects of their culture, of their language, of their worldviews, their epistemologies, of the sort of things that help to center them and to continue to achieve against tremendous odds and to maintain all of those important aspects of who they are as a people and who they are as individuals. And to me, that's really the real story, the sort of true story, the important story of 2012. There's sort of this moment now in which people are paying attention to Maya. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity for us all to sort of learn more about Maya and sort of what's that history and what they're doing now and what they hope to do in the future. And I want to do this, at least in part, through Mayan voices and Mayan images. So I'll share some images and also some quotes with you all to hopefully give you a sense of the sort of richness of Mayan knowledges, ways of thinking, and worldviews, and how they approach this. And I also understand that a number of you have read maybe all or parts, or at least looked at the cover of Engendering Mayan History, so we certainly can talk about those sorts of issues too. I want to work in a kind of conversation about why gender matters in indigenous peoples' historical reconstructions, right? But mainly I want to talk about the sort of achievements of Maya in the modern world and argue that they're important enough on their own, and they deserve to be heard and seen and appreciated for what they are, rather than what non-Maya popular culture would like them to be, right? And to be fair, this 2012 phenomena is not sort of the first time that Maya culture has been co-opted or used. I mean, they're in National Geographic, right, a number of different occasions. They've even been on The Simpsons. Survivor had a Maya show, right? So there's other ways in which Maya have appealed to popular culture, certainly. But thinking about the ancient Maya and the sort of heyday of the ancient Maya is really from about 250 to about 900 AD, in this period when they were producing thousands of artworks and hieroglyphic writings, a sort of dazzling legacy of literature, as well as learning, art, and architecture. But they weren't preoccupied with the apocalypse. Maya creation mythology is really an attempt to record tales of the past world, but it did not do it in detail and a sort of focus on the end of that world or predicting an end date by any means. Instead, Maya appear to be more fascinated with recreation. And I want to talk a little bit about two different types of time that Maya think about and conceptualize, both linear and cyclical. But that is that this sort of figures prominently in their oral histories, oral traditions, and in their myths. And that is that Maya perceive time as a complex set of infinite cycles, not one that is going to end on December 21st, 2012. I hope I'm not already disappointing people by saying that this is not precisely what the Maya were arguing. But one of these cycles, known to scholars as the Maya long count, consisted of more than 5,000 years. This is the one that started in August of 3114 BC and is due to end on December 21st, 2012. Right? But this is something that they perceive of as a sort of ongoing time, right? A way that a nice analogy, I think, is the way that we were sort of nervous about Y2K, right? The roundness of a number, right? Because in Mayan numerology, that date is 13, you can see at the bottom here, 0000, right? So in some ways, there was some concern, perhaps, about the roundness of that number. But nothing to suggest that that would be the world's last day, right? And to quote Dr. Anthony Avini, who's a Russell Colgate Professor of Astronomy and Anthropology at Colgate University, he says that it's poor astronomy to reduce cycles of 26,000 years to days and months. And he also says, I quote, "The glorious achievement of the Maya and other complex cultures of the ancient world are appealing enough on their own. Such is the ability of Maya to follow the position of Venus to an accuracy of 500 years with the naked eye. We don't need to dress them up in Western apocalyptic clothing to make them impressive." And it's tricky in a way to sort of pinpoint where this information, this sort of obsession of the 2012 ology comes from. And part of that is because the advocates of 2012 generally don't tell you which Maya calendar they're basing it on, right? Is it the Maya long count? Is it the short count? Is it the lunar cycle? Is it the solar cycle? Is it one of the ritual calendars, right? So there's all sorts of different calendars we could point to, right? But seldom do we get sort of specific information about what those might be. I do want to point to a couple pieces of evidence that I think have been used by 2012ologists to say that, yes, this doomsday is coming, that Maya had predicted this, to actually look a little bit more closely and see that Maya archaeologists and scholars have demonstrated that there are very different sorts of interpretations when you look closely at these. The first piece comes from a glyphic text that recorded this very date, 130000. And it was found on a plaque in Tortuguero, Mexico, at a Mayan site. And originally it was sort of ambiguously read by Maya scholars in 1996 as predicting some kind of ominous event, perhaps that a deity from the underworld was going to come back to the living world. And they posted that on the internet. And it sort of took on a life of its own on the internet, with people then saying, well, yes, this is going to be the final date, December 12th, 2000, excuse me, can't get that wrong, right? That's a crucial day to get right. December 21st, 2012 was going to be the end of time. But in fact, when Maya scholars and archaeologists start to look at it more closely, and this seems to be the consensus of this plaque, they established that it really was an effort to date a future commemoration at a point in which the king of that site at Tortuguero would impersonate or perhaps sort of represent a deity on that day. So in many ways, if we think of it that way, it was not a doomsday prediction, but rather a sort of bold prophecy that that building that the plaque marked would still stand on December 21st, 2012, which I think actually is pretty reassuring. That's still going to be around. Right? Another piece of evidence that these end-time believers use is a carving that was made 23,000 years ago at a site in Izapa, Mexico. And this one depicts a caiman, a macaw, and a man dressed in a cosmic map. Right? And scholars of Mexico and Mayas continue to debate the meaning of this image. Right? But 2012ologists have said, well, this cosmic map is actually showing, it's charting the future of a sort of dramatic realignment of the stars. That, in fact, this is going to predict a world-changing galactic alignment. Right? This, despite the fact that Izapa was a pre-Maya city and was inhabited by people that neither recorded dates nor wrote texts. And also that, that most astronomers dispute the claim that the galactic alignment is rare or even ominous. Right? And then in some ways, there's a more recent discovery by a team not too far from us, from Boston University, archaeologists there, just this year, discovered a wall that was almost like a blackboard. And some of you may have read about this. There was a lot of sort of attention paid to it. But there are images and numbers and text written on there, almost as if the sort of Maya mathematicians and scholars are testing out different theories. But what the archaeologists were able to discern from that was that their sense of time went back at least 7,000 years, so that even this Maya long count cycle that we thought was the longest cycle is short by a couple thousand years in some Maya conceptualizations of time. Right? So that, too, points to other interpretations of the Maya doomsday prediction. Right? And then, in a way, you can also look at linguistics and point to the way in which the Maya languages think about time very differently. Maya languages tend to be much more spatial than either English or Spanish, the other language primarily spoken in Guatemala and Mexico. And they have this way of talking about these sort of nebulous periods that are far into the future or far into the past. For example, it's the Ojer for something that happened a long, long time ago. You could never date it, right? You just know it's sort of passed down through tradition. And also in that language, it becomes clear the way in which they're negotiating both linear and cyclical time, right? And so the sort of linear time is to talk about singular events. You see this a lot in their oral histories, a lot of sort of research that I've been fortunate enough to do, in chronicles, in alliances, right? In looking at their sorts of lineages, right? But then they also use cyclical time to talk about cycles of the past, so that wars, famines, diseases, natural disasters, all of these are sort of cycles that come and go throughout people's lives over generations, right? So that too gives a sense of, repeating, not necessarily repeating, but a recycling of time, right? That they don't sort of pick one date when everything might in fact end. Right? So I wanted to share a few images that come from a mural that was painted in the Quechiquel Maya town of San Juan Comalapa. This is a town that is well known for its artistic tradition. In fact, a number of, well, at least one sort of world-famous Andres Kuruchich painter has, in the 50s and 60s, he was traveling to Europe and other places in the United States to show his artwork. And this is part of a broader movement in Guatemala, and I'll talk more about the Civil War. But this came out of the Civil War that ended in 1996, and the United Nations and other non-governmental organizations that were there working to try and bring about a sort of process of reconciliation and healing. So one of the projects that the United Nations was and continues to be involved in is mural production and painting on the walls in these highland towns, allowing Maya peoples to sort of depict the past from their own perceptions. So this first image, what you see is sort of the beginning. And the way that this mural plays out, you drive up to this very verdant area. It's beautiful. cornfields and everything. You get up into this highland town, and one of the first images that strike you is this 61-panel mural on this cemetery as you enter into this town. Very colorful. But you see here the way in which the Maya representing the 4 different colors of corn, the 4 types of corn they plant, which also are symbolic of the 4 cardinal directions, right? And the way in which corn is crucial to their very livelihoods and existence and survival, right? Most Maya people have a milpa, a sort of combination corn, bean, and squash plot. Even professionals who work in Guatemala City and are there most of the week, most of the month, they too would have a small plot in the highlands, not that they would sort of use for subsistence, but just as that kind of spiritual connection to corn. And they're really, the Popol Vuh and their oral traditions, they talk about how the gods created Maya people out of corn dough, right? So corn is really essential to their identities. And in some ways, this perhaps is another link between why we might be sort of fascinated with Maya, because in a sense, as U.S. citizens, we too are people of corn, right? Most of our diet consists of corn in the sort of beef, chicken, and pork that we eat, since most of those animals are corn-fed, right? Also, sort of the soda, other processed foods, oftentimes are made with high fructose corn syrup, right? So in this way, there's another sort of connection, I think, between Maya and people in the United States, right? And so another piece, oops, I'm confused. Another image here, what you see is, sort of Maya creating these hieroglyphs. These are historians or scholars that are writing about the times in which they live, as well as the past and into the future, right? And the people who created these murals here in 2002 were artists, teachers, students, and other community members in an effort to try and portray their past, their history, as well as, to be honest, attract tourists to the area. And so you see, these are the images they have of the ancient Maya. Here they are going and making offerings to the gods, to their pyramid, to their temple there. Men, women, and children all involved in this, all sort of crucial part of this. Right? And then also we'll talk a bit about, especially, thinking about that book, Engendering Mayan History, the role that women play in Maya communities, in the sense that women had a very important role in the ancient Maya world. And then this here is a depiction of Ixchel, who is the goddess of weaving, among other things. And you sort of see how, women are coming out of this loom that she has woven, the different sorts of roles and responsibilities, the economic contributions women make, the social, the cultural contributions, the sort of reproductive contributions that women are making in these Maya societies. And so when we're thinking about the end of the world, none of these images speak to this sort of prediction, right? And if it's not there in the oral history, it's not there in the archaeological evidence. We'll talk a little bit, too, about the way Maya or daykeepers or priests are looking at this. It's really not there in this sort of, any of this kind of information we get from Maya. Where it does come from, I think, a sort of more convincing argument is a U.S. and European fascination with the doomsday, with the apocalypse. Right? This kind of comes out of a Western tradition, if you will. And there's a few explanations for this, I think. One of which is sort of the persistent power of ancient wisdom, right? We're all sort of attracted to that in a way. This kind of time-worn, mysterious, almost, coded knowledge, right? And then the excitement of decoding it, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons why the Da Vinci Code has sold over 100 million copies. I mean, that's sort of what it appeals to, right? And in other ways, that's part of what attracts people to religion, right? Sort of figuring out these kind of mysteries, at least having the mysteries to kind of figure out. And we're also drawn to the knowledge of ancient civilizations, right? Before the Maya, who sort of had their star turn more recently here with the 2012 predictions and the sort of recent excavations taking place in Mexico and Central America, last century it was the Egyptians, right? Sort of ancient Egypt, the early 1900s, as archaeologists are excavating the tombs of pharaohs, and we're sort of learning about that amazing society too, right? So there's that piece of it, this sort of fascination with ancient wisdom, but also this sort of deep Western notion that kind of lays within a Western civilization of a religious tradition, right? And of this sort of obsession almost, if you will, which include teachings about the end of the world. Right? And we can date these back to medieval Europe, right, and even before them. But people are, that early on, in sort of stark contrast to the Maya evidence we have, people are talking about the end of the world. And occasionally, individuals would sort of stick their necks out, then, as today, and pick a day, in which the world would end, right? So in 1260, Joaquin de Fiore predicted that the world would end, and a number of Europeans followed him. They believed that this was true, that it would end in 1260. And then more recently, 1843, the English-speaking world was sort of fascinated with one of our former neighbors from Vermont, William Miller, who predicted 1843 as the end of the world. And then when that didn't happen, he predicted 1844, right? So there's some flexibility in these end-of-the-world predictions too, right? And most recently, Harold Camping's prediction, 2011, if people remember that. First it was going to be May, and then when the world emerged unscathed, then he put it off to October, right? And finally he sort of had to give up on 2011, right? And so there is this kind of long tradition of these doomsday predictions that are starting to now kind of glom onto this 2012 fascination with the Maya. And in another way, there's also a sort of explanation to be held here and the kind of comfort that I think there is this kind of security of taking a leap of faith, right? The great revolutions in sort of science, industry, and technology, most recently over the last couple hundred years, have profoundly transformed life on Earth, right? But science, has not replaced religion. Instead, the two are sort of counterparts, right? They're sort of hard to distinguish. In some ways, science is a religion, and religion has become a science, right? So anxiety and skepticism abound. The more answers that science offers, the more questions we have. And we're overwhelmed by evidence for this phenomenon known as global warming. And yet some people choose to believe it and others do not. Right? In the end, I think you start to see in these 2012ologists a sort of turn towards the upbeat, that perhaps there is this kind of a more positive shift coming. And maybe it will not be the end of the world, but rather this kind of a wonderful new beginning. Right? But ultimately, this idea of rapture was not my idea, and it's not today my idea. But the sort of phenomenon that's built up around it has meant that in many ways Maya spirituality has become a commodity. Right? And there's always been a performative aspect to Maya spirituality. So you see here a Maya priest starting one of the ceremonies that they held just last year for Wakshakibaks, which is 8 monkey, which is the traditional Maya celebration using the 260-day lunar calendar of the new year. Right? So it sort of shifts based on the solar calendar every year. Right? And there's this pretty strong consensus that Aqir, or these Maya priests, will generally agree that December 21st, 2012 is not going to mark the end of the world, that it's not going to be a cataclysmic event. And again, here my apologies to Anouar, if that was the hope, right? And then the talk would be forgotten perhaps, right? But rather that it's a dawning of a new age, right? That there's all sorts of hope and possibility here. And ideally, that it would mark the end of a period of suffering and domination that was heralded by the Spanish invasion, Spanish conquest, subsequent colonialism, and neocolonialism thereafter. So I wanted to share also a few quotes from a Maya priest or Maya Aqir. And you see some of the other images here. So what they're doing is making these offerings here. They start with the coals, the flowers, candles, bread. There's some aguardiente in there somewhere. I didn't think I quite captured it with the shot there. And this will ultimately, they'll light this up as part of a Maya offering to the gods, as this sort of bringing in the new year based on that 260-day lunar calendar. And I also wanted to sort of share some insights from one of the Maya priests, Kawokuma Chavez, who is a Quechiquel daykeeper. He was raised in a traditional family. He went out and did rituals with his family in their milpa and their farm, but he also went to Catholic church Sundays with the other community members, right? There's this real sort of syncretism and hybrid approach to religion and these sort of Maya understandings of spirituality. So I'll share a few of these. I thought what I would do is let you all read the English. I would speak a little bit of the Quechiquel, again, hopefully to kind of get us into that mode of the way Maya are thinking or speaking. So here we have Katseton Yan Hule, Katseton Yan Ri Kabrakan, Katseton Yari Nusoloch Ri Ripaloch, Katseton Chukachik Ochik Kayewal, Patak Tinamit Harek Ibing, Akatit Amama. right? So you can see from the English, I won't read that for y'all. I know y'all can do that. But there's not the sense of denying that change is coming, right? There's sort of this recognition, okay, that this will mark a significant date, or at least in some ways, that's what they're working towards. And we'll talk about how they're doing that too. Manuk aberta chi manak ayewal, manik aberta chi nikis hun baktun nuk achik hun. Right? So they're saying that it also is going to be challenging. It's going to be difficult, for sure, right? This new era brings judgment. In some ways, individuals like Kawok are taking advantage of this opportunity to proselytize, right? To sort of teach people about this idea. Romari nikatsin chi wakamin chupamrik anawal nikahik ribanaki nikahik riakwala. Right? So it's an opportunity to spread knowledge about themselves. And so Maya, too, are trying to sort of take advantage of this moment, right? And we'll see that sort of they also are understanding the kind of risks involved in this kind of leading up to it. Hare nakavir roch chi yoka pahun chi dimension o pahun chi rakan ir. So, sort of trying to share this in their own words, right? Their understanding. This idea of dimension obviously is not a Quechua word. Ek o hun tak tatas nikibir chuk'a chi chupam baktun konoher riunatli ek o patak tinamit panima tinamit harek ayef iban chike o ribinaki ek o achiel pak ais ek o pakachelach mankantak ayef stibir kan hare rishka tape. Right, so here making a distinction between rural and rural living, urban and rural living, excuse me. And some of these Maya priests will say that, in fact, this is going to be a difficult transition. The folks who are already living in rural, more self-sufficient communities are probably going to be better off. Again, with a sort of idea towards this idea of global warming, recognizing that there are some pretty significant changes coming, and perhaps they're related to that. Ekal, ukatach kan kitzir. So this is process of understanding. That sort of comes about. And in many ways, they're hopeful for this future. And I think one of the things that's so fascinating is that Maya priests and others, the Nobel laureate Rigoberta Menchú, the Quiché Maya woman who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992, they have been working and preparing for this new dawn. It's not a sort of expectation that this is all just going to happen, right? But there's really been an effort to sort of try to produce a solid legal basis for improved Mayan lives and livelihoods in places like Guatemala and Mexico, especially. And in some ways, they have enjoyed some success in this. So in 2002, we saw the founding of a presidential commission that was established to try and eradicate discrimination against indigenous peoples in Guatemala. The following year, 2003, they passed a Ley de Idiomas, which said that any individual who spoke a Maya, one of the 22 Maya languages, or Xinca Garifuna language, would be represented and should have an interpreter in all judicial, legal, and healthcare facilities. 2009, we saw the opening of travel between Guatemala and Mexico for Maya peoples, so that Maya from Guatemala could go to the Yucatan Peninsula, Campeche, Quintana Roo, right? Other areas where Maya lived, right? Just trying to kind of to lessen those borders, right, that are separating Maya peoples. And then 2010, all public and private schools by law had to teach a Maya language in school. This was perhaps one of the most radical developments because for 500 years now, Maya have been told that speaking their language makes them backward and ignorant, right? There was not a sense of pride in Maya peoples, especially in Guatemala, to a lesser extent in Mexico. But of course, there also have been setbacks. In 2009, a law that was designed to protect sacred Maya sites was rejected in the legislature, and so now individuals themselves have to do that on their own, on a sort of legal basis. And the most ominous of these, what I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a moment, is just last month, on October 4th, in Totonicapán, where a number of Maya peoples were attacked by the Guatemalan military and police system. Police officers when they were holding a protest. And so getting back to this 2012 phenomenon, Maya themselves are concerned about sort of fallout, the potential that this might not look good for them if the world doesn't end in 2012, right? And yet the Maya voice is largely silenced in much of this, right? Their writings in both modern writings and glyphic ancient writings are used as emblems rather than read as texts. One daykeeper from Tecpan explained his concern this way, and I quote, "What will happen on the 21st? We will celebrate the end of one cycle and the beginning of the next. We will do this with proper reverence, sharing with our ancestors. But what will the non-Maya say? They will say, nothing happened. Those stupid Maya, they were wrong again. It is not us who are saying the end will come, but we will be blamed when it doesn't." And actually, there's a wonderful source. If you're interested, you could Google on YouTube. It's called 2012, the Mayan Word. And it is about an hour-long documentary of Maya priests and spiritual leaders talking about the idea of Maya time, and particularly this idea of the time-space continuum and how it's based in the sort of texts of the ancient Maya. And in many ways, Maya today are certainly active participants in the world, both intellectually, economically, and spiritually. They travel and read internationally. They are contesting ownership of their myth history with the tourist industries of Guatemala and Mexico, Belize, other places where Maya live. They also are contesting their history with non-Maya academics, right? So they are starting to develop their own voices in these conversations, right? And one of the leaders is a Quechiquel ethno-historian by the name of Edgar Esquit. And he is writing critically both about non-Maya perspectives of the past as well as Maya perspectives of the past. He's concerned with the way in which some Maya scholars have sort of co-opted Guatemalan state ideology and discourse, right? And is sort of advocating for alternative histories that would allow critiques of both Maya perspectives as well as non-Maya perspectives. And their hope is, through these efforts, that in fact a new dawn, a new age will emerge after December 21st, 2012, a day in which Maya can participate in their respective countries as full citizens. Right? So I want to take a look, too, at the sort of longer history, and I'll keep this brief. I'm sure people sort of have some knowledge of this. But, you know, to kind of emphasize and underscore this remarkable resilience, right, and what Maya have faced since that Spanish invasion. So, I should have forwarded this slide, but this is the image of once the ceremony gets going, and they have lit the offerings to the gods for this Wakshaki Bats celebration. And so I want to return to some of the images from that mural I talked about in the highlands of Guatemala, in this Quechiquel town, and look at the way in which they have presented their past and sort of challenges they face. So this first image is depicting the Spanish conquest, Spanish invasion, right? And what's interesting about it is they're also, in a sense, suggesting that there's a certain battle over who controls history, who gets to write about that past, right? What you see in that sort of top half of the image there. And then, of course, the kind of military aspect of it down below there. Here, yet another image, which is sort of showing some of these ancient Maya symbology, right, as kind of now starting to clash a little bit with these Spanish soldiers and their horses and guns and steel. The forced labor during the colonial period, right, where Maya peoples were compelled to work for Spaniards, those who tried to settle Guatemala as a colony for themselves. Right? So here you see this image of Maya in their traditional clothing, making bricks to then build. In the background, you see there the Catholic Church, the colonial Catholic Church, right, during the colonial period. And one of the things that is interesting to me about these historical images in the mural is the images that aren't there, right? So they sort of jump forward from this colonial period to already into the sort of 20th century. There is no celebration of Guatemala's wars for independence. And it was sort of a series of developments for Guatemala to finally declare its independence. But Maya almost unanimously say that didn't represent independence for us. That was independence for the non-Maya, for the state, but not for indigenous peoples, right? And thereafter, what you had in sort of the 19th and 20th century was a series of dictatorship or strong-armed leaders. You see an image here of Jorge Ubico, who was a dictator in the 1930s and 1940s. And these images come from La Gaceta, from the Police Gazette. And it's showing you here this sort of photographs of Maya coming and, in a sense, sort of making offerings to the dictator, right? In the same way you might think of them making offerings to the gods. So they're sort of trying to figure out this relationship. How can they best strategize during these sort of difficult times, right? And here, too, you see a Maya woman making an offering here again, and there's the dictator on the left, Jorge Obico. And there's this long string of dictators, both conservative and liberal in their politics, but there's sort of a general trend of trying to exact Maya land and labor. And here, what you see is a photograph from 1907 of a group of Maya men who were essentially the leaders of what was known as the indigenous municipality. And what's so fascinating to me about this image is that there's a clear embracing of both culture and modernity, in the sense that, as the Quechiquel historian I was talking about, Edgar Skeet, talks about this process of superación del indígena, or this sort of indigenous people surmounting or overcoming great challenges. One of the strategies for Maya peoples was literacy and education, right? And so you see that, and this is a posed photograph from 1907, that likely these Maya leaders asked the photographer to take and paid for. And so you see the man there on your left, right? He's sitting there seated writing with paper, right? As a sort of embracing this idea of literacy is going to help us to move forward in this country. At the same time, they have embraced the ethnic markers. Here you see the sherka, the cloth laying down in front of their white pants. You see the hats, the traditional hats that they wore. You also see them barefoot. All of those were markers that non-Maya would say that's an indication that Maya are backwards, that they're ignorant, right? So Maya are finding a way to try and move forward, to try and embrace these strategies for improvement without having to concede their culture. Here's a photograph a few years later, and these are Maya leaders from a nearby town, the same town in which that mural was from that I've been showing you. And here, too, you see the man on the left, right? He's got his pen, he's got his paper. The man next to him has got his hand on the desk, again, sort of embracing literacy. Education is a way to move forward. And yet there they are, barefoot, with the sherka, with those traditional hats, right? Sort of combining these very symbols that non-Mayas would have said, those are, you could never bring those together. Maya either need to give up their culture to move forward, or if they want to maintain their culture, they're simply going to continue to be backwards. And so those are some of the strategies they use to try and confront these challenges they're faced with. And in general, there's a certain class component to this too, because generally Maya elites were in some ways successful during this period, the 19th and 20th century. And yet the vast majority of Maya were still seen as kind of working class laborers, manual laborers in many ways, right? So here I'm taking you back to La Gaceta, that police gazette. Here's a cover of one of the editions in 1942. And what you see here is a man and a woman. You can't quite see under his hat, but he used what to call the tapal, or a tump line across his forehead. A very sort of symbol of backwardness, of a lack of economic improvement or economic development, according to non-Maya peoples. And here in this photograph, it's sort of celebrating the fact that Maya were the hardworking peoples. And then the woman who's accompanying him a few steps behind, the indication that she uses her head, right, to carry goods, right? But still, they're both manual laborers. And then the title at the top also speaks to this sort of effort to both celebrate Maya and claim them in a kind of paternalistic way. It translates work, faith and religion of our autonomous race, right? Our race, nuestras indígenas sort of thing, right? That Ladinos or non-Maya peoples really were the ones who sort of controlled Maya-turness to a certain extent. And yet, yeah, they're very hardworking. That's great. They have that great work ethic, right? And also attempts to sort of present Maya, hardworking Maya is also very joyful here, right? So you've got this image of Maya market women who were dominating highland markets. They would set up in the central plazas. And there was this effort afoot in the sort of 1910s, 20s, 30s, and 40s to move women out of these marketplaces, to kind of reclaim public space for non-Maya and put market women in these controlled spaces, these indoor marketplaces. And women largely refused it, sort of stood up to these dictators and largely refused to do that. And what you see here is an image of them in this town, Patsassia, which is also a highland Quechiquel town. And here, too, the title at the top there reads, an abundance of white smiles and pure charm on the faces of Native women. Right? Look how happy they are, these hardworking Native women. It's sort of an attempt to both celebrate and also maintain them as peoples who aren't going to go very far, necessarily sort of challenge for national economic or political power. Here I give you a little bit more of a sort of close-up. You can really appreciate those smiles and pure charm, right, for those indigenous women. And then there's this significant transition, and this is a history that probably most folks here are familiar with, right? But that democratic transition in 1944, they overthrow the dictator, and then for 10 years there's this period of democracy, becomes known as the 10 years of spring, right? And then in 1954, largely encouraged by a US CIA engineered coup, there's an overthrow of the democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz. Right? And there's a very rich, kind of ugly history to that, at least from this kind of perspective of the United States. And thereafter starts military dictatorships and military governments, which then sort of morphs into the Civil War that lasts from 1960 to 1996, and the genocide that took place in the early 1980s. What's so interesting, I think, here again, there is no image of either that democratic period or the 1954 CIA coup in their murals. And there's really not much talk about it in oral histories either. In some ways, I think we've sort of, here in the United States, primarily historians, scholars have sort of latched on to that date as a crucial date in Guatemalan history because the United States invaded Guatemala, right, sort of undermined this democracy. But Maya see it very differently, and I think it suggests that we need to kind of rethink the primacy of that event as we're trying to think about how we might tell the past from indigenous people's perspectives. And what happens now in the images from the mural is that they jump to this, what seems to be in the oral tradition, in these images in the mural, a really central piece of their history. And that was this massive earthquake that struck in 1976 and leveled the highlands of Guatemala. Particularly Maya peoples were most affected by this. There's this really ugly joke that kind of always comes up in Guatemala after whatever this disaster is, a natural disaster, hurricanes or earthquakes. So in the case of the 1976 earthquake, it is, what does the 1976 earthquake have in common with a Western movie? The answer is only the Indians die, right? There's this sense that Indians are the indigenous people that are most susceptible because of the way they live, that this is almost predetermined, right? And this focus on the earthquake surely gives us a sense that that is an important kind of central factor, a key date, a key event in their histories, both in the oral traditions as well as their painted images here. But there's also a way in which they connect the aid given in that 1976 earthquake, mostly coming from European U.S. sources, to the Civil War that sort of intensifies in the Central Highlands as a result. And in the oral histories, they talk about how oftentimes that aid was conditional. And some aid workers would come and talk about Marxism and communism and how they really need to change this from a kind of systematic and structural way. That was how Maya peoples are able to improve themselves. And the military governments in charge caught wind of that and started targeting Maya peoples who had been recipients of the aid, whether they were sort of open to that Marxist or communist ideology or not. And you'll see here, so the image of the Red Cross, the aid workers there. Here too, again, the sort of aid. And there's a sense in which they're both appreciative for that international help to help them rebuild their communities, but also a sense in ways in which they did that on their own. But that connection between the aid and then moving directly into images of the Civil War. That there was that strong connection between the Civil War intensifying in that period. Right? And so the Civil War, over 200,000 people were killed, over 1 million displaced. And there were 626 indigenous villages that were razed, wiped out, and that no longer exist on the map in Guatemala. And the majority of people affected by that were Maya peoples. They really bore the brunt of that Civil War. And both the United Nations and the Guatemalan Catholic Church had done studies of the Civil War, and they both independently identified a period of genocide in the early 1980s, primarily during the dictatorship of José Efraín Ríos Montt, who ruled from 1982 to 1983. This is sort of the most intense period of that Civil War. And you see here one of the images sort of showing a highland village now being destroyed, right? And here, this is an image of the insurgents, sort of the cost that they're paying in the war, they're kind of losing. And in many ways, as the mural continues to tell the story of the Civil War, you see a condemnation of the role of the Guatemalan government, the Guatemalan state in this. You see here an image of the Guatemalan flag, right, which normally has the quetzal on it, but here the quetzal is bayoneted with blood dripping from the two guns, right? And the flag itself is used to impale a Maya man, right? And clearly they see the Guatemalan government as responsible for much of this violence, right? And that was another finding that both the United Nations and the Guatemalan Catholic Church came to independently, is that the military committed over 90% of the crimes during the Civil War. And the insurgents probably somewhere about 5 or 6, and then another 2 or 3 they couldn't quite identify. But there's also this sense that Maya can overcome these challenges, right? In many ways, the mural ends on a very hopeful note, right? What you see here is young people sort of celebrating, right, the end of the Civil War. You see that at the bottom there, the sort of guns are being sacrificed, thrown in the fire. The two books that they're holding are, in fact, the United Nations Remy Report and the Guatemalan Catholic Church's Human Rights Report that document the Civil War, right? You see one woman wearing her traditional clothing still, this sort of adhering to culture, right? You also see the images of the corn here, right? The 4 different colors of corn, the Maya tradition, certainly keeping on there, staying strong. What's interesting, again, is sort of omission here, is that there's no representation of the Guatemalan government or Guatemalan state in that image, right? There's no flag, there's no constitution. Even the 1996 peace accords, which formally ended the war, is not there. There's a sense here, like that the Quechiquel ethno-historian was saying of superación del indígena, that it's going to come from indigenous peoples themselves to bring about this sort of new dawn, this new opportunity. So I should check, how am I doing on time? Should I start to wrap it up here? Okay, great. So what I thought we might do then is I have a few other slides of sort of the images of gender relations that we find in those Maya murals, and I'll sort of, we can go to those perhaps in the discussion. But I also wanted to share sort of one last quote from Maya peoples themselves, and this one comes from an editorial that was written early this year that was published in a Guatemalan newspaper, and it's from 4 Maya leaders writing about December 2012, and sort of the challenge that it presents, and also their sort of hope of the change that it might bring about. So they say, today is the time for the Maya people to show the world their spiritual practices, scientific knowledge, and worldviews. That is how to celebrate both before and after the transition from Oshlahu Baktun to Kahlahu Baktun, that is December 21st, 2012. This is the moment to reinscribe our history with contemporary Mayas as protagonists, retaking our own symbols as our grandmothers and grandfathers did. So that's what I would hope people would sort of take from this 2012 phenomena, a sort of celebration of Maya past, present, and future, and perhaps even a kind of solidarity with Maya movements. Ni maho ni matio shik chiwe hanila utsi nao hanila utsi wanima shi iya rekalem chike nutsir achiel hantape ni mani wikin. So I want to thank you very much for listening to my words, respecting my words, as I will certainly do with yours. So thank you for that.
Thank you. If you have any questions, please get the microphone and you're welcome to ask them.
Hello. My question is, do you think gender roles are important for culture and the development of society? And if so, what do you think are the major attributes from each gender?
Yeah, that's a great question. I sort of try to develop that in the book, and maybe some of these images too help. And I think it's crucial for sort of understanding the differences. And one of the ways that this was really driven home for me is when I started my research, I really wanted the sort of research project to come as much from the community as my own interest. And what invariably was happening when I said I wanted to learn about the past and how might that help the community, and what they asked for was to write a book in Quechiquel in their own language that could be used in the schools. But what they invariably did was to say, oh, if you want to learn about the past, you need to talk to the elder males. Right? There was this very specific sense of who were the history keepers. When I went back, this second book, this the Engendering Mayan History, this was, in a way, I guess you would say, a more assertive attempt to get at women's history, to get at the way gender affected the way people think about the past. And one example is that I sort of lead in that book with the chapter about midwifery, and this sort of hero of Maya women, a woman by the name of Hermana Catu, is this midwife who sort of stood up to the government efforts to regulate healthcare, right? And I never learned about this woman from Mayan men, right? That she just didn't exist in their histories. And yet here is this very strong, powerful history for the women that really gave them a connection to who they were and what they were sort of about, and gave them a sense of confidence, right? So in that way, I think gender really does matter, right? And there's also a sort of struggle, I think, in understanding as I was kind of thinking about feminist writings and literature in the United States and Europe. And some of that was resonating, but other parts weren't, because Maya women and Maya men are in some ways oppressed in similar ways, right? But then Maya women are oppressed in other ways, like that image of the men writing. The photographs from that period always showed women either weaving or sort of doing domestic sort of activities, never with access to education, right? Which is another piece I talk about in Gendering Mayan history, this sense of not allowing women to go to school and what the reasons for that. So that also, women sort of had ambiguous, ambivalent feelings about what that meant. But yeah, there again, gender is crucial for understanding the kind of opportunities and sort of challenges that women face. And one last piece of that is, now that women have overcome that, it's almost come full circle, and so that university-educated Maya women have a very hard time finding a partner and a mate, because men are intimidated by that now, right? So it's the dynamic sort of changing in a number of ways. But yeah, I think gender is crucial and sort of at the heart of it. Yeah.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation, but I really came to hear more about the shift that I've heard about so much from many sources, one being a local access television program 2 years ago, in which the whole question of a change or consciousness change, or whatever the name might be, was discussed by elders from groups, ancient peoples throughout the world. And the point was that the same theme exists in all these different cultures. And the elders from each of these groups had a very similar story to tell, which makes me think that there may be more to it than just the Mayan culture. And whether you have saw this presentation or are familiar with what is being said. I can't say who made the film, but that's really what got me interested in the whole notion of consciousness change. And it was all about that there will be an end and a beginning, but it's a spiritual end and a beginning, an end and beginning of values, outlook, creating greater global cooperation, greater oneness with the earth, love of animals, recovering some of that oneness with the natural world. And it was said by many elders from many places, Indonesia. So I just wondered what you had to say about that.
Yeah,
Thank
you. I think that's a really important question. I'm not familiar with that specific show you're talking about. But thinking about Joseph Campbell's work with myths, right, and how he's finding all of those commonalities, ancient peoples telling similar stories from very different places that weren't necessarily connected. Oh, sorry. So I was thinking, what that makes me think of is the evidence, the very strong evidence of the kind of the point I was trying to make is this kind of search for explanation. There's mysteries in the world that we want to understand, right? And that's why oftentimes religion takes on that role. In Joseph Campbell's work, trying to look at myths and understand the commonalities within those myths amongst very disparate peoples, right? And so I think that there's sort of these very human questions that we all share, no matter where we might be living or sort of culture we're brought up in. And you're right that there are these efforts, and that the change is, in fact, not likely to be sort of cataclysmic, but rather more spiritual in efforts. And that's, what I think Maya priests themselves are trying to grasp onto is an opportunity to educate peoples about the Maya cosmovision and worldviews and things. And like you say, so many other peoples are doing that, not with this precise date. But yeah, there is a hope and particularly with Native American, other indigenous peoples, peoples who are generally oppressed in societies, are struggling to sort of make their voices heard and bring about more just relations. So I think that's something that a lot of groups do share, and you see that kind of commonality. Yeah.
Hello, David. Hi.
I didn't plant this question, by the way, but I'm hoping it's going to be a bit of a softball.
It's a softball.
Thank you.
It's a softball. So one of the striking things is after 500 plus years of colonization and of being dismissed and oppressed, the Mayan are getting this international attention, right? Positive attention. People really are, people from across the world think that they can foresee the future. Meanwhile, they've been dismissed and oppressed in Guatemala. And so my question is, what has been the Ladino response, the city people response, the response of basically the people who've been oppressing them for so long? What's been their reaction to all the attention the Maya have gotten?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Rob. And there's a much longer history, too, because you're right, yeah, there's much more attention on Maya now. But really, since the period of about the 1930s, there's been an effort on the part of Ladinos or non-indigenous peoples, and particularly governments like Jorge Ubico, to capitalize on tourism, on Maya images, and attracting tourists to Guatemala for that. So at the same time that they celebrate, and you see some of those images that sort of celebrated the Maya, there's also a strong feeling that Maya are really second-class citizens, and that when you're not talking about tourism and trying to bring in international money, international development, that in fact there's still a pretty clear hierarchy, a pretty clear distinction between Ladinos seeing themselves as much more capable, much more talented than Maya. And this got even trickier in some ways after the Civil War, because there was this infusion of money, particularly from Europe, that non-governmental organizations had access to, and most of this money was going to Maya organizations. A lot of it was language revitalization, but it also had to do with sort of economic development. And Ladinos started to get frustrated, because there certainly are poor, oppressed, marginalized Ladinos, right? And many Ladinos got frustrated that they weren't the recipients of this aid. And so it's a very complicated relationship that becomes even more tense in a way. I mentioned briefly Rigoberta Menchú, the 1992 Nobel Prize recipient. You would think that a nation would sort of rally around someone who won the Nobel Peace Prize. Ladinos thought it was outrageous that an indigenous person won that prize, right? They thought it should have been the Ladino president who had kind of garnered the peace accords. So yeah, that tension is very much alive and in some ways sort of heightened by this. Yeah.
I got involved in this because of archaeology. Did you do any studies comparing the pyramids of the Yucatan and Maya to the Egyptians and others around the world?
I myself have not done, I'm not an archaeologist. I mean, studies have been done in which, again, the sort of commonalities that the woman who asked the question earlier were talking about and sort of remarkable in the ways that you might honor the gods and think about how you could establish the kind of physical structures of religions and things. So there certainly are some pretty remarkable commonalities in that sense. Yeah.
Here locally, we have a speaker that's been speaking 4 times now. His name is David Lonebear Sinapas. He's a Sajin with the Micmac and part of the Wabanaki tribe. And he's describing the same, in essence, what's happening, and that his last speak is on December 21. And he has shared a lot of information with the people that have shown up. The night before he spoke last week, there was also a speak by the Native Indians that went through the same process that the folks in Guatemala went through, where their entire culture, their families were all broken up into separated from each other, and that this is truly this time, is what they're saying. It's coming back to the unification of them and all the other souls on the earth, and that all the indigenous people are leading this concept. It's been amazing what I have learned from David, that they are so well educated that I wonder where we got ours. Thank you.
It's remarkable, you're right. And what's interesting is a number of indigenous groups from the States are planning to travel to Guatemala for December 21st and be at some of these sacred Maya sites. Not with a sense of the end of the world, but sort of what you're talking about, this renacimiento or rebirth, perhaps, right? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I don't think I need a mic. No, you do.
I had a question, since you're someone maybe in this room that's kind of sat and been with indigenous Maya people from Guatemala more than maybe anybody else, and if there's someone else I'm excluding, stand up. So I'm wondering, from yourself personally, your personal experience, if in fact, humanity is faced with a shift in consciousness, some sort of shift in thought or shift in perception with the coming month, what, for yourself personally, how have you been affected from the time that you spent with these people in Guatemala? And what, from that time, what did you bring back here to your own personal life? What changes did you make? How are you honoring your time or what you learned there in your own life in a practical sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. At the risk of becoming too personal, one of the ways in which it manifested itself, when I was first learning the language, going to Guatemala for summers and living with Maya communities and Maya families. I was also in Tulane in grad school, and I had this sort of very difficult occurrence that happened to me when I was there one summer, sort of devastating in many ways. And when I got to Guatemala that summer to continue my studies, people, Maya friends, immediately noticed that, and they set up one of these ceremonies for me, what they call a kutunik, which is a soul calling, basically, because the belief is that you sort of have, in the Spanish, the term is susto, fright, in which your soul actually leaves your body, right? You sort of become disassociated with your soul. And so there's these ceremonies that are done to call your soul back, to make you feel whole and one again. And what was so wonderful about the ceremony itself was that it was this mix of Maya religion, Catholicism, but they also called upon my own ancestors. So they were talking about my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and the healing process that took place for me, it wasn't immediate, but it really started me down a much better path and a much sort of stronger and more stable road to kind of work towards healing. And then the other piece, I guess, is sort of on a more practical day-to-day basis, is trying to be aware of the kind of natural world in which I'm living, and trying to also teach my own children about that, and sort of this respect and understanding that we're sort of part of a much bigger, what we would, the term we'd use here would be ecology, right? A much bigger sort of system at play than, sort of our own individual and human lives. But I don't know if that gets at your question, Chris. But probably doesn't give you enough, probably, to...
I'm reserving for myself the last question. So the two things. Would you say the Zapatista rebellion in the 1990s was the first instance in which Maya consciousness sort of erupted onto the global scene when we became aware of the Maya? Because it looks like the 2012 event seems to be doing that. But to me, the Zapatista rebellion probably was an earlier instance of such consciousness on the part of the global scene. But and secondly, the question that kind of vexes me a little bit always is that we seem to be fascinated, and in fact, we seem to romanticize a lot the Maya, the Aztecs, the Incas, all the great Native American civilizations of South America, but somewhat at the expense of the Native Americans at home. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, thank you, Anouar. So for the first piece, I think the Zapatista movement, which exploded on scene in 1994, right, the sort of countervailing the NAFTA agreement, that does garner international attention. It was incredible sort of savvy that Subcomandante Marcos and other Maya had, using the internet, other sources to kind of protect themselves. And the very system itself, it was very egalitarian. You had, they didn't solve everything, but they, women's issues were on the table from the beginning, right? They sort of were figuring out how that gender question that was asked earlier, how does that make sense in a revolutionary movement, right? But even before then, I think when Rigoberta Menchú wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992, that too sort of elevates this. And maybe a little bit before then, when her book is published in 1987, I, Rigoberta Menchú, the sort of the testimonial literature, the term that's used in Latin America, gave people a sense of Maya people struggling against tremendous oppression and the sort of efforts and movements that were afoot to counteract that. So yeah, Zapatistas were an enormous part of that for sure. And then the second question, there is this really interesting fascination, and I noticed this when I'm teaching at USM. Students really enjoy that first half of my survey class in which we look at the Aztecs, excuse me again, the Maya, all these other really remarkable groups. And almost as a sense, people are sort of more and more, I think, becoming aware of Native Americans in the United States, but there's a way in which it's easier to talk about them outside of our own country than it is within our nation. It's a messy history, right? And that history just doesn't come through very strongly in the public school system, even once you get to the university level, right? I mean, we're seeing more and more of that being introduced. I think, you were talking about earlier, sir, about that Wabanaki Truth Commission, right? That's moving forward. So we're learning about this, certainly, and trying to grapple with these issues, but they're much easier to grapple with in the exotic sites of Mexico, Guatemala, than they are in Maine and the United States, where we sort of have this history of, gaining our independence and justice and liberty for all, right? Even though that wasn't really the history and what happens. But it's difficult to, I think, sort of struggle and grapple with those issues here. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. They have 14 people who are watching us from across the country, and including one from New Zealand. So, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.